Good morning and welcome. My name is Loretta Lyons, and I am the programming librarian at Guilford Free Library. We are pleased to welcome back Bob Potter for today's program on Picasso's Portraits of Women. I would like to thank Sil for co-sponsoring this talk. Art educator Bob Potter is a graduate of Syracuse University's School of Visual and Performing Arts. He spent his early career as an art director at Scholastic Magazines, Time Warner, and National Geographic. Over the past decade, he has helped create an arts therapy program for Save the Children, was a corporate development officer for the National Gallery of Art, headed marketing for Mystic Seaport, and is a docent at the Yale Center for British Art. If you would like to ask a question at today's webinar, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. And now, please join me in welcoming Bob Potter.
Thank you, Loretta, and good morning, everyone. I look forward to sharing Picasso's Portraits of Women with you today. But before we get started, I do want to thank Loretta and the Guilford Free Library and also the Shoreline Institute for Lifelong Learning for co-hosting this art lecture. I've been giving art lectures on the art of the portrait for a number of years, and I wanted to share with you today Picasso's Portraits of Women. In his lifetime, Picasso created thousands of works of art. And looking at Picasso's ever-changing and evolving work through his portraits of women was a way for me and many others to not only look at his vast career of creating art, but as importantly, the lives of the women who inspired and endured his creativity, often at their own emotional peril. Here we see Picasso on the left in an iconic photograph by photographer Arnold Newman. And on the right, portrait of Jacqueline. We'll learn more about both as we go forward. The subjects of these portraits, lovers and wives, all had one thing in common: they would be his muses, a constant source of inspiration, imagination, and experimentation in how the artist interprets the human face and form. And in doing so, they were instrumental partners with Picasso in revolutionizing modern art. Picasso's paintings of women could be lyrical and sensitive, as in this portrait of Fernande Olivier, his first great love. The portrait is titled Lady with Fan. It was painted in 1905. In his 1932 painting entitled The Dream, he presents Marie-Thérèse Walters, his 17-year-old mistress, as a woman deep in sleep. Picasso uses thick outlines to define the bold shapes of lavenders and pale blues of the face and figure, contrasted against a bright red chair, against a background of harlequin painted wallpaper. In his painting of Dora Maar in 1937, called The Weeping Woman, a Yellow Shirt, Picasso reflects the horrors of war in a woman's violent tears. But how should we look and feel about Picasso's portraits of women today, knowing that Picasso was notoriously cruel to his partners, a serial philanderer and womanizer? who could be fiery, jealous, and even violent, to the women, lovers, and wives who were his muses and subjects of his portraits. How do we reconcile Picasso's behavior and character with the beauty and bold visual drama and experimentation of his portraits of women? A few years ago, in a retrospective of Picasso's portraits of women at the Vancouver Art Gallery, curator Katharina Besigal said, quote, "I would be very happy if you take away from this exhibition that these women were truly part of the creative process. Their lives and what they experienced and their stories mattered to the way that we see the paintings and the way they were painted. They are the creative osmosis of Picasso's work," unquote. So today, I hope this is how we will be looking at Picasso's portraits of women. Before we explore Picasso's portraits of women, I'd like to spend a few minutes looking at Picasso, the artist, through his own self-portraits as a way of better understanding his way of seeing and painting. Picasso painted many self-portraits throughout his life. Here at the age of 18, as an art student in Madrid, we see his mastery of drawing. Then at the age of 20, in his early years in Paris as a struggling artist, a gaunt, cold, emaciated figure. And into his 90s, when after nearly a century of fame and fortune, he would continue to explore and record his own face, as in this self-portrait painted in June of 1972, a year before his death. This was the year I came to New York, having just graduated from art school at Syracuse University. This self-portrait by Picasso looks a little bit like the way I felt when I first arrived in New York City at the age of 22, wide-eyed and slightly crazed by my new surroundings. In each self-portrait, Picasso confronts and almost hypnotizes the viewer with his dark eyes and penetrating gaze. In the early 1900s, Picasso discovered African masks on display at the Paris Museum of Ethnography. Picasso takes the raw, angular, stark characteristics of African sculpture and incorporates these facial characteristics and bold geometric shapes in this self-portrait painted in 1906. A year later, Picasso continues to be influenced by African art, and he would create a painting that would shock, outrage, and revolutionize modern art forever. In 1907, Picasso exhibits Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a group of 5 prostitutes in a Barcelona brothel. It's now in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Not since Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, painted in 1863, had Parisian critics and society and fellow artists been more shocked by a painting. Here, Picasso abandons all traditional norms of figurative art, breaking every rule in the book. The perspective is flat. He distorts and fragments the female face and body in crude geometric body parts of flatly painted color and harsh angular line, challenging and destroying the expectation that paintings of women should offer idealized or at least identifiable representations of female face and body. The influence of African mask is clearly seen in the faces of the women in this painting. Matisse thought this 8-foot square painting was a hoax. The painter André Durand said, quote, "Someday we shall find Pablo has hanged himself behind his great canvas," unquote. Picasso struggled with the subject, creating more than 100 sketches and preliminary paintings. In each face is the evidence and inspiration of tribal mask art. One of Picasso's earliest portraits of women was this sensitive painting of his mother, Maria, in profile, done when Picasso was a 15-year-old art student. He clearly had mastered the technique of classical painting, drawing, and composition. He adored his mother, eventually taking her maiden name, Picasso, instead of his father's name, Ruiz. But I think you would agree we wouldn't be talking about Picasso today or looking at his art, as people have for more than 100 years, if this is where he stopped, developing as an artist, this artistic young prodigy. He was only beginning. In 1904, at the age of 22, he would leave Spain and settle in Paris in Montmartre, where in a squalid studio, he, as an artist, and much of modern art as we know today, would be born, especially in his portraits of women. Picasso's model and first great love from 1904 to 1912 was Fernande Olivier. She was reportedly Picasso's first known long-term relationship and was a subject of many of Picasso's Rose period paintings from 1905 to 1907. She had run away from an abusive husband at the age of 19 and into a tempestuous relationship with Picasso that would last for 7 years. Here she is depicted as Lady with a Fan, painted in 1905. She was an artist model who had striking red hair, almond eyes, and was a modern, liberated woman, unlike anyone Picasso had had a relationship with before. Picasso would paint more than 60 portraits of Fernande Olivier. Fernande had modeled for other artists, but when she moved in with Picasso, he would forbid her to model for anyone except him. His jealousy was such that he would sometimes lock her in his studio when he left. In this painting of Fernande Olivier, entitled Woman Plaiting Her Hair, painted in 1906, we can see the influence of African masks, the beginnings of Cubism, and it appears as if a woman is almost emerging from stone, from sculptural materials into a painted form. Picasso and fellow artist Georges Braque would invent a new and radical way of seeing and painting. They would break apart and reassemble from multiple perspectives of still life, everyday objects, and the human face. As we see in this painting by Picasso, again, of Fernand Olivier, a painting entitled Woman in Pairs. In the background, we see pears on a table. We see drapes of green cloth on the right. And then we see her face recreated in different planes, in different perspectives, in painterly colors, in geometric shapes. A new way of seeing the human face in art and portraiture. But by this time, Fernand was becoming irritated by Picasso's intense possessiveness. And in 1912, a few years after this painting, she left him for an Italian painter. 20 years later, she would write a vivid memoir of her life with Picasso, which he would hire lawyers to block its publication. In 1917, after the death of a close friend, Picasso left Paris and goes to Rome, where he meets and falls in love with the Russian ballerina Olga Kotlova, the daughter of a czarist officer. Here she poses for a glamorous publicity photo. And on the right, she poses with Picasso, who looks more like a prosperous Wall Street banker than bohemian artist in his three-piece suit, pipe, Homburg hat, and walking stick. Olga Kotlova was born in the Ukraine, and she was a principal dancer in the Ballet Russe, founded in Paris by the Russian impresario Sergei Diaghilev. This acclaimed avant-garde dance company included Vaslav Nijinsky, seen on the right, in one of his memorable performances in Afternoon of a Faun. Picasso meets this beautiful ballerina while he designs costumes, sets, and paints this fanciful curtain for the ballet called Parade, which Olga and the Ballet Russe are performing in Rome. Rome and ballet were both foreign worlds to Picasso at this time, and each enchanted his imagination. The ballet was a 1917 collaboration of impresario Sergei Diaghilev and poet Jean Cocteau, with music composed by Eric Satie. I'm not sure such a triumvirate of great talents had assembled again until West Side Story and Bernstein, Jerome Robbins, and Sondheim collaborated on what is considered America's greatest musical. Unfortunately, unlike West Side Story, the first night audience of Parade applauded the curtain and booed the avant-garde ballet and music. In addition to the stage curtain, Picasso designed the costumes. And we can see in a modern revival of the ballet Parade, these costumes and the original stage production. Picasso not only designed the costumes, he designed the horse and he designed the stage sets. Olga would leave the ballet company and return to Paris with Picasso, where she and Picasso married in 1918 at the Russian Orthodox Church in Paris, In this painting on the right, Olga in an armchair, painted in 1918, it was painted the year they married. Here, Picasso poses her in more traditional Spanish dress with fan. More the wife of a Spanish gentleman. He drapes the chair with a Spanish shawl. And Olga holds a fan looking more like a prim and proper Spanish marquesa, a wife of a Spanish gentleman, which would, Picasso hope, appeal to his proper Spanish parents, much more than a Russian ballerina born in the Ukraine. Over the next 5 years, Picasso would paint many loving and serene portraits of his first wife, Olga. In these portraits, there's a mood of calm and quiet repose. Her face on the left is more a sketch with sparse details in line and sepia and brown color. The three-quarter seated figures in the center and on the right wear the same fur collar and blue dress. In the center painting, Picasso uses line and thin translucent paint for the dress, burnt sienna for the armchair hair and fur collar. He paints her face in white. The figure on the right is saturated in vibrant color. In each, we see Picasso's constant obsession and experimentation with how many ways can he explore and interpret a subject in paint on canvas. In 1921, their son, Paulo, was born, painted here in one of Picasso's most enduring portraits of childhood, a little boy dressed in a harlequin's costume. After their son's birth, Olga and Picasso's relationship deteriorated as Picasso began in secret a new passionate affair with a much younger woman. Olga and Picasso would never divorce. She was in years later dismissed as mad by many of Picasso's friends. She would stay legally married to Picasso until his death from cancer in the French Mediterranean's resort of Cannes in 1955. Here we see her seated in three-quarter profile, clothed in fiery, warm colors and deep shadows. One of the pleasures of putting together an art lecture like this is discovering new works by Picasso, and this was one of the new works that I discovered, and it is one of his most striking and enduring portraits of women. His first wife, Olga. The Girl Before a Mirror, painted in 1932, revealed to the world Picasso's 22-year-old muse and mistress, Marie-Thérèse Walter. And the world now discovers a woman other than his wife, Olga, has entered Picasso's life. It is one of Picasso's most well-known paintings and one of the great masterworks in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Picasso would paint the young girl multiple times during the 1930s, during one of his most prolific periods of creativity. Marie-Thérèse Walter would excite a new period of art exploration and experimentation in painting. In this painting, a nude woman reaches for her reflection in a full-length mirror and is confronted by a dark, disturbing version and vision of herself. A woman admiring her image in a mirror has been a classical motif inspiring artists for centuries. Peter Paul Rubens' Venus at a Mirror, painted in 1615, shows Cupid holding a mirror to reflect her face as a black servant looks on. Edouard Manet employs the same idea in this painting from 1876 entitled Before the Mirror, which at the time was considered scandalous, displaying a real woman partially dressed, not Venus, the goddess of love. Nothing metaphorical here. This is a real Parisian woman, half clothed. Toulouse-Lautrec would abandon all sense of propriety with his painting of Woman Before a Mirror from 1897. So we can see Picasso's painting retains the familiar subject of a woman before a mirror, but radically reinterprets color, composition, and form in an exploration of the duality of his subject. Patterns of circles, diamonds, and lines swirl and flow around the two figures in a reflected embrace. The physical and the psyche entwined. Picasso would write, "Who sees the face more correctly? The photographer, the mirror, or the painter?" Are we to paint what's on the face, what's inside the face, or what's behind it? I think this probably is the best quote I could think of or share that would explain Picasso's approach to painting portraits of women. We see on the left her face is divided in two, a lilac-colored profile with flowing hair and a blazing yellow sun face with bright red rouged cheek. In the mirror's reflection, her face has changed. She is aged, and orange teardrops from her eye, perhaps in recognition of her own mortality. Picasso met Marie-Thérèse Walter when she was 17 and he was 45 and still married to Olga with their 4-year-old son, Paulo. In 1935, Marie-Thérèse Walter became pregnant. They would have a daughter named Maya. When Picasso's wife, Olga, learned of her husband's pregnant mistress, she moved to the south of France, taking her son, Paulo. Marie-Thérèse Walter would write about Picasso saying, quote, "My life with him was always a secret, calm and peaceful. We said nothing to anyone. We were happy like that. And we did not ask for anything more," unquote. Here, Picasso paints Marie-Thérèse Walter in a painting entitled The Dream. He uses a palette of bright reds, lavenders, and yellow, with a Harlequin-inspired pattern in the background wallpaper. It captures a young woman deep in sleep, her head resting gently on her shoulder. Although she looks like she will have a terrible crook in her neck when she awakens. And many art critics and observers have noted what appears to be a very phallic-like part of the subject's face. I'll leave that to the art critics and Freud. The Dream was once owned by Las Vegas casino mogul Steve Wynn, who accidentally put his elbow through the canvas in 2006, just after agreeing to sell it for $139 million to hedge fund mogul Steve Cohen, who at that time had just bought the Mets. Now, contrast this painting with the portrait of Marie Therese. She is wide awake, alert. Her face is seen in both profile and straight on. Rather than a woman asleep, here Picasso is playing with cubism, creating the seated figure in a pattern of horizontal colors and triangles, rounded shapes with exaggerated hands, all against a distorted, flattened perspective of tilting floor and walls and ceiling. Both paintings reinforce Picasso's love of mixing bold patterns, line and compositional design, with an exuberance and excitement in the act of simply painting color. During his lifetime with Marie Therese Walter, Olga and Picasso would never get a divorce, because Picasso wanted to avoid the even division of property dictated by French law. This is a charming photograph of Marie Therese Walter in Brittany in 1928. Sadly, on October 20th, 1977, 4 years after Picasso's death, Marie Therese committed suicide. She was only 45 years old. In 1936, Pablo Picasso met Dora Maar. She was a painter and a photographer. Here, Picasso paints a portrait of Dora Maar from 1937, again incorporating, as he did in his Marie Therese Walter portraits, cubism, different points and perspectives, exaggerated hands, vibrant colors, strokes of paint everywhere. And yet the eyes always command our attention. Dora Maar was an artist in her own right. Here on the left, she also displays her talents as a photographer in a photograph entitled "The Years Lie in Wait for You." Was she thinking about and seeing what awaited her in the years to come with Picasso? On the right is a painting by Dora Maar, The Conversation. Is it a conversation with herself or another intimate friend or confidant? The conversation about her life with Picasso. Dora Maar would also document Picasso's painting of his 1937 masterpiece, Guernica. She became Picasso's lover from 1936 through April 1944. Picasso referred to Dora as his private muse, but Picasso also understood the power of publicity and the talents of Dora Maar as a journalistic photographer who would capture the artist at work. On this masterpiece, Picasso painted Guernica in response to the bombing of Guernica, a Basque country village in northern Spain, by Nazi German and fascist Italian warplanes. Warplanes that were invited by President Franco and the Spanish nationalists. The painting would be part of a touring exhibition used to raise funds for Spanish war relief and brought worldwide attention to the Spanish Civil War and the artist, Picasso. Picasso painted Dora Maar as the weeping woman in a yellow shirt, a weeping woman tormented by the horrors of war, as are the figures in his painting, Guernica. He paints her again in a yellow shirt in 1939. Both paintings exercises in Cubism and portraiture. And in 1941, he paints Dora in a more traditional, sensitive, nude portrait, painted in muted tones and washes of ink, black, and sepia paint. Dora Maar would suffer with depression during her years with Picasso and in later life be treated with electroshock therapy after a nervous breakdown. But Dora Maar would outlive Picasso, and both her photography and paintings would be presented in exhibits devoted to presenting Maar as an artist, not Picasso's muse, an artist in her own right, including international exhibitions in Munich and Barcelona. In 2006, Sotheby's auctioned Picasso's Dora Maar with Cat. It was sold for $95.2 million to a mystery bidder, making it at that time one of the most expensive paintings ever sold in auction. But the art market isn't quite what it used to be. Portrait of Dora Maar, posed in an armchair and painted in 1941, was auctioned a few years ago at Christie's with an estimated value of between $20 and $30 million. A third of what Dora Maar with Cat sold for. I oftentimes don't include commentary on what paintings sell for. I sometimes think too often it's so far out of the realm of imagination or checkbook for all of us. And I think it unfairly tries to validate art with a dollar sign. But it is worth noting at these astronomical, unimaginable prices that paintings sell for today. I do only note it, but would much rather focus on the works, the subjects, and the artists themselves. When she was 21 years old, Françoise Gillot, a young art student, met Picasso in a cafe in the spring of 1943 in Paris. Dora Maar was devastated to learn that Picasso was replacing her with this much younger artist. Françoise Gillot and Picasso would stay together for 10 years. She was the mother of his children, Claude and Paloma. Picasso's portraits and drawings of Françoise are sensitive and expressive, as in this drawing with her crown of leaves. And in this painting, a study in boldly painted line with a yellow necklace and voluminous auburn hair. And in this Cubist portrait that reconstructs her body in geometrical circles and yellow and purple triangles. Picasso is captivated by her youth and beauty and hair, as we see not only in his drawing on the left, inspired by the photograph on the right. Woman with a yellow necklace on the left, and then in a photograph displaying the portrait on a painted little chest with Picasso sitting next to it. I'm sad to note, and as all of us would be offended, that black little dot on her cheek is not a birthmark. It's where Picasso burned her with the end of his cigarette. On a happier note, one of my favorite photographs is Picasso marching along the sand, holding a beach umbrella as a giant parasol over Francois's head. It was taken by Picasso's close friend, the photographer Robert Capa. Francois was fiercely headstrong and grew tired of Picasso's abuse and affairs. In 1953, she left Picasso and moved with the children back to Paris. 11 years later, in 1964, she published an intimate memoir of life with Picasso, an account of her extraordinary, turbulent years with this temperamental man, this abusive artist. At the time, it sold over 1 million copies in dozens of languages. Picasso would unsuccessfully attempt to block its publication. And in retribution, he disowned their children, Claude and Paloma. Francois would go on. And in 1970, married American physician and medical researcher Jonas Salk, who created and developed the first successful vaccine against polio. Francois would not only survive Picasso, but go on to establish herself as an internationally respected artist in her own right. Her works are in major museums, including Metropolitan Museum of Art and Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and MoMA, amongst many. She would also be awarded the Chevalier de Légion of Honor in 1990, the highest French order of merit established in 1802 by Napoleon Bonaparte. And she's still going strong. This is a photo of Françoise Julot, taken in 2016 in her New York City apartment, sitting next to one of her works of art on an easel. And this portrait, this photograph rather, was taken just a year ago when she celebrated her 100th birthday. A remarkable woman. The last love of Picasso's life was Jacqueline Rogue. In 1961, Picasso met her when he was 72 and she was 26. She would become his second wife after the death of his first wife, Olga. They met at a pottery studio where Picasso was making ceramics and she was in charge of sales. Picasso would paint many portraits of Jacqueline. And Jacqueline would say of Picasso's paintings of women, quote, "If my husband ever met a woman on the street who looked like one of his paintings, he would faint." In 1 year, Picasso painted over 70 portraits of her. Their marriage lasted 11 years until his death, during which time he had created over 400 portraits of Jacqueline, more than any of Picasso's other loves. One of my favorites is this portrait. Jacqueline sitting, her arms wrapped around her knees, in profile. Picasso using expressive, bold, dramatic strokes of black for outline and detail, a blue Mediterranean sky, Spanish tiles. She looks like a Greek goddess, a face that could launch 1,000 ships. Their life together was joyous, happy. In this photo, taken in 1957 by their close friend and acclaimed photographer David Duncan, we see a happy, loving time between Picasso and Jacqueline. It was photographed at Picasso's Villa La Californie in Cannes. Jacqueline and Picasso are seen in a playful moment as she teaches him the basic steps of ballet. This lino-cut print by Picasso of Jacqueline, entitled "Woman in a Hat with Pom-Poms," has always been very special to me. It was reproduced countless times in posters. My wife Jean and I had one of these posters in our first little studio apartment in New York back in the early 1970s. Somewhere along the years, it has disappeared, and I wish I still had it. But I really have no idea where it disappeared to and why we don't still have it. I wish we did. Jacqueline Roque looked after Picasso's estate after his death in 1973, fighting with Francois Gillot and her children, even preventing them from attending Picasso's funeral. Eventually, Francois Gillot and Jacqueline Roque agreed on establishing the Picasso Museum in Paris, which, if you haven't visited, I certainly hope you will have the opportunity to. On a sad note, in 1986, 13 years after Picasso's death, Jacqueline killed herself by self-inflicted gunshot. She was 59 years old. This is a portrait that Picasso did of Gertrude Stein. It's a well-known portrait. The famous quote, when Gertrude Stein saw the painting and expressed to Picasso, "Well, that really doesn't look like me." To which Picasso replied, "Be patient, someday it will." Over the many, many years of Picasso's life and work, his many, many portraits of women remain as examples of his imagination, creativity, but also legacies of the women who were his inspirations and partners in transforming modern art. Gertrude Stein would write, quote, "He alone among painters did not set himself the problem of expressing truths which all the world can see, but the truth which only he can see." Well, we've looked at many of Picasso's portraits of women, and many I know are probably familiar to you, but I hope some have been new discoveries. And hopefully you may have a deeper understanding and appreciation for the lives and sacrifices of these women, whose intimate relationship, not only with Picasso, but more importantly, I think, the artistic process of making art, of which they were the subject and the inspiration. Now I welcome your comments and questions. And Loretta, I think you were in charge of any of those that may have been typed and submitted.
Well, thank you, Bob, for that wonderful presentation. We'll give it, there are no questions in the Q&A quite yet, but we'll give it a minute in case anyone has something on their mind they would like to ask.
Certainly. And Loretta, I'll start with you. Anything that you saw or discovered or just reacted to in looking at Picasso's portraits of women?
The image that really struck me was the mirror. I don't know if we can go back to it.
I think we can. Hang on one second. And which one was that?
I think it was about 5 slides in at the beginning.
Oh, okay.
A little bit further down.
Yeah, just
Sorry, I should remember
that's okay. There's a lot to
I know there are so many images.
We'll just keep.
Maybe it was further down. Well, if we don't pull it
that's
up.
All right. This is
there we go. We just passed it. This one, yeah. The woman looking in the mirror. Yeah.
Indeed.
And it made me wonder about his understanding of women. I mean, it seemed like, he's certainly not well known for his relationships with women, and he used them. But I do wonder about his insights into how women perceive themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, it certainly is the male gaze.
Yeah.
And also, we're in 1932, and psychology and Freud and symbolism and dreams, and at a time surrealism is so prevalent, so influential, is really in the DNA of everything going on in the arts, post World War I. So this, I think, we might look at it, and others might agree, Picasso sort of trying to look at this more as psychology, interpretation. How do we see ourselves? How might a woman see herself? How he might think that she sees herself in a mirror, and then his own interpretation of what she sees. Certainly Picasso maybe at his best or at his worst. It's always that dichotomy, but its impact, it is one of his most iconic paintings. And one that I think, again, hopefully this little talk, since we've kind of at 500 feet looking at so much of Picasso's life and work and the lives of these women, will inspire the attendees. Hey, I think I'd like to go learn more about Picasso. I think that book might be something I'd like to read. I'd like to kind of learn more about, not just the work as we've seen it in art history books and on museum walls, but as I'm always very interested, who are the subjects of the painting? Who are they? Without them,
exactly.
Right. You've just kind of eliminated a pretty big chunk.
There are a few comments and questions.
Yes, indeed.
Q&A now. So there's a question from Barbara Holden on why would you think he treated women so badly? He had a good relationship with his mother. What went wrong? That's a big question.
I think there may have been volumes of books written about that, because it really is perplexing. He loved his mother, but abused the women in his life. We can't, I guess, just dismiss it. Well, a product of his time where, it was kind of if not sanctioned, somewhat ignored and seem to be so prevalent. It is really the perplexing problem with Picasso, some alliteration for you. And I think many people over the last number of years have stepped aside and said, enough of Picasso. Great. Yes, he probably the most influential artist of the 20th century, but he, unfortunately, like oftentimes, if we had Picasso looking in the mirror in a self-portrait, would he see himself in a different way? I doubt it. He would see himself as the Minotaur or the bull or the whatever, maybe in the later years in those self-portraits, he saw someone that maybe he didn't like so much, but I don't know that. I can't answer that question.
Yeah.
But it is something that really, I think, distresses, rightfully so many people when we go on and on about Picasso.
There's a comment from Annika Dilling. I understand that Olga forbade Picasso to portray her in a surrealistic way. I'm amazed that he kept this promise. So any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, and the first part of that again, Annika's question?
I understand that Olga forbid Picasso to portray her in a surrealistic way. So any thoughts on that he actually kept that promise?
I don't, that's a really good question, Annika, who is a fellow docent at the Yale Center for British Art. So thank you, Annika, for asking that question. Very good question. These paintings on the left that we're seeing, let's bring that up into presentation format. Okay. Voila. Certainly during this period, Picasso is experimenting, exploring, yet these paintings of Olga are perhaps more classical, traditional, sensitive. They certainly aren't abstract, grotesque. I don't know the answer to that. I think I'd have to do more investigation on Picasso's portraits of Olga. And were there any that were more cubistic? I don't know. That'll be my homework and yours, Annika.
And one last question, Bob, from Pamela. Was the painting of Dora Maar a picture of the war or her fate when Picasso left her?
Good question. Let's go to that. There we go. This is Guernica, of course, which we're all familiar with, this very, very large mural. And one of the reasons that I superimposed this painting, because it was so reflective of this crying woman and these victims of this bombing. So I think that, I'll go to the next, going wrong way, sorry. 1937, The Weeping Woman. Guernica, 1937. So they're painted at the same time. They're painted when Picasso is confronting this bombing, this war, this tragedy, this horror, and so in many ways he's this at exactly what time during 1937, which month, what came first, what's going on. But this is what Picasso is immersed in. He's obsessed with. He's undertaking something of a size and a format that he hasn't really undertaken since he did that painting of the ballet screen, you know, it's a giant work. I don't know if this is the largest Picasso work of his. It would certainly have to be up there, but they're happening contemporaneously. The Weeping Woman and the Guernica mural of war.
And then Bob, just one last, actually a comment from Betty Mans. She wanted to thank you for such an interesting display of many portraits I've never seen. Fascinating.
Right. Well, that I like, and when we discover new works, that's really great. So thank you again, all of you who joined me today, and I enjoyed sharing these works with you. So I'm looking out the window and I see the sun is shining, so go out and enjoy this great September day. There's still summer out there.
Thanks so much, Bob.
Bye-bye all.
Bye all.